again, thank you all for being here. When we started talking about Norman Rockwell, I realized something really important. I have grown up around Norman Rockwell kind of being ubiquitous around me. My grandparents had lots of Norman Rockwell illustrations and paintings in their home, and so I feel like I've always just been around Norman Rockwell. When we started talking about doing this presentation, I realized that I don't know anything about Norman Rockwell the person. And so I think that is probably a lot of us. And so why should we be talking about Norman Rockwell?
Well, I think you're right. I think that is the thing, and that's what we're going to focus on tonight, is his life. We're not going to talk a lot about his work. We're going to save some of that for maybe a later presentation. But I think that's not uncommon. Most of us can pull up a mental image of a Norman Rockwell painting or an illustration, but you might not know a lot about his life. And so we're going to spend some time kind of chronologically going through his life and talking about some of the high points.
Well, then I guess we have to start at the beginning, right? So
Let's start at the beginning. That's right.
Norman Rockwell's life.
So tell me what you think of when you think of a Norman Rockwell image.
When I think of Norman Rockwell, I think of like kind of Americana, maybe country life where there's, boys running down to the fishing hole, or, just scenes from everyday life like Christmas or things like that, but very kind of quaint, charming, small town. That's what I think of.
Do you think of this?
No.
Okay, would anybody else think of this if you think of Norman Rockwell? No. So Norman Rockwell was born in 1894 in New York City, and this is a photograph of New York City in 1894. So this is what he was born into, obviously not what he painted or ended up illustrating. And he was born into kind of a firmly middle-class family. His father was in textiles. And it's so interesting to me that someone who was born into kind of this world has ended up becoming ingrained in our minds as a very prominent part of 20th century American culture. And he just is. His name is an adjective. We say Rockwellian, we say Rockwell-esque. He's mentioned all the time. So, we've kind of got to talk about him. And it's important too, I think, because he is an artist and an illustrator who, if you notice the quote that was on the image, the first image that was up, it was all about a story for him. He's a storyteller, and he always tells stories with his paintings. These were not the stories that he told, although these are important stories as well, but he chose to tell other stories.
So he starts in New York City, but where do we go from there? How do we get to what we
Good question. So he's born in 1894. Parents, as I said, middle class, textiles. They live in New York City, in the middle of the city. They take family vacations in the summer. So he does kind of get out of the city. He's able to go spend time on farms, sort of not terribly far outside of New York City, sort of in the upper part of New York State, a little bit here and there. And that's when he discovers farm life. That's when he discovers milking cows, running around, fishing, playing with friends, doing things like that. And that's what he clings to. His father's fortunes sort of went into decline at a certain point, and his family had to start taking in renters or tenants, and some of them were not the most savory characters. And he often saw violence, so he was sometimes surrounded by people who were drunk, people who were fighting, things like that. And that's not something that we kind of equate with Norman Rockwell. We don't see that in his work. So he had those things happen that were kind of traumatic in his childhood, but he looks forward to these trips to the country in the summer where he gets to hang out with his brother Jarvis and catch frogs and go fishing and do all of that. And then he goes back to the city and kind of has his life in the city.
Well, I guess for somebody who ends up idealizing country life so much, it makes sense that it was kind of his escape from the realities that would be kind of tougher for him in the city. So at what point does the art come into his life?
Yeah, so the art comes in pretty early. His father is artistic. When sort of in his spare time, his father draws, does things like that, and Norman picks this up because we all, when we're young, we sort of emulate our parents and we do things that our parents are doing. And so he does some of that, and his parents recognize that he has a propensity and a really high level of skill with what he is doing. So at 14 years old, he is taken out of school and he is enrolled in an art school. And that's a pretty big deal because that wasn't common. This would have been so he was born in 1894, do the math real quick, 1908, something like that, right?
I see steam coming out of
Yeah,
it.
exactly. So somewhere in through there. So he's enrolled in art school, and so that's when the art really starts happening. And it happens young for him. He's successful early. His parents actually relocate because they recognize this talent and this ability. And they move to a town called New Rochelle, which is not terribly far outside of New York City, and it's sort of on the coast. And they moved there because it's an artist colony. And he's surrounded by other artists and some really kind of important people in the art world at that time. And one of them is J.C. Leyendecker, who was the preeminent illustrator of American art at that point for the Saturday Evening Post. And Norman Rockwell kind of stalks him, really becomes a friend. He kind of works his way into his life.
Well, all about Eve.
A little all about Eve, learns all of his contacts, kind of gets everything he can from him. He also, Frederick Remington also lives there, which if you're familiar with Frederick Remington, very famous American painter. And this was the house that Remington lived in, and this was where his studio was located. So he befriends him as well. And he, whether it was, nothing bad about it, but he was just doing what he could to get ahead in the business.
He was networking, right?
That's
what we call it now,
absolutely,
right? Networking.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So, he goes to art school at 14. His first big commission happens at 16 years old. His first book illustration is at 17. He is the art director of Boys Life at 19 years old, and his first Saturday Evening Post cover happens when he's 22 years old.
So, yeah, that's pretty amazing. So, you've mentioned illustration and art. So what is the difference between illustration and fine art? Because I think that's important for us to understand with regard to Rockwell.
So the simple answer to that question is that illustration is for commercial purposes. So when an illustration is created to be sold or to be used on publication. So he's quickly, people see that this guy is talented, and he quickly becomes an illustrator. Now that is not to say that he doesn't possess the same skills and the same talent level as someone who's a fine artist, because I believe he does.
Yeah.
And I believe that having seen a lot of his paintings in person, I think that they are certainly fine art. But at this point in time, he was an illustrator. This is an image of him with one of his models from his first post cover. The boy tipping his hat is the boy behind him. So he painted and drew the people that he knew, and I mean, you can tell. Look at him. He's a baby himself.
Yeah.
He's so young. So this is probably when he's in his early 20s. So anyway, find success early.
So Illustrator is more to be mass produced.
Yes.
Right? If I'm understanding that correctly.
Yes.
And so he had moved to New Rochelle, kind of in this more artist colony. He had started to find some success at this point, it sounds like. With his art, so he was able to get jobs and commissions and things like that, right?
He did, and he's in New Rochelle. He has success, and the other thing that I think people think of when they think of Norman Rockwell is this sort of maybe a homebody because of the things that he painted. When he was in his 20s, he was a man about town. He joined the Navy for a very brief stint. He was declined at first because he didn't weigh enough to get in.
No jokes.
He went home and ate donuts and bananas all night long and drank a lot of water and went back the next day and was accepted. But he didn't stay very long because physically he just kind of couldn't keep up, and he was discharged honorably, so it just didn't last long. But he marries in the 20s. He marries a woman named Irene. And they socialize. They're part of the big kind of social circuit of New Rochelle. And he sails and he plays golf, and he does all of these really kind of cosmopolitan things that we just don't think of, or that I don't think of when I think about what I kind of knew of Norman Rockwell.
Roaring 20s though, right?
Yeah,
so
it was the Roaring 20s, absolutely. And he was part of it, and he's still a big success. This is his first studio on the left. Here he is at his easel. You can see he's still quite young in that image. Big success, financially really successful. He was paid a lot of money at the time to create the illustrations that he did. He joined civic and social groups in New Rochelle. There he is kind of in the center leaning up against the wall. And this is a group of men who were in charge of the public art in that city, all of the signage and those kinds of things. So he really kind of became involved and gave back to the city.
So that gets us kind of through the 1920s. So what starts happening for him in the 1930s?
Yeah, so he, in the 20s, he continues to work. He's really successful. He still is doing all of this illustrative work, working from live models always. There you see him doing that thing. Still lots of illustrations for covers. Then he and his first wife separate. She leaves him for another man. They go to the West Coast to get sort of a fast divorce. And while he's there, he meets this woman 2 weeks after his divorce. And 2 weeks later, they get married.
So he invented the rebound marriage.
Maybe he did. Maybe so. So her name is Mary Barstow. They married 2 weeks after meeting, and then they moved back to the East Coast. So they sort of go back to New Rochelle.
Don't be getting any ideas from that, by the way.
Okay. So they marry. They do. He kind of. I don't want to say that he has kind of a crisis with his career, but they decide in 1932 to move to Paris because he does a lot of illustrative work, and we know what he does and how he does it, but he's really interested in what's going on in the art world in Paris, which at that point in time was the capital of the art world. So they moved to Paris for about 8 months or so, and then he says, you know what, I think I probably had it pretty good back in the United States, and they come back to the U.S. And they then eventually move to Vermont in 1938. So that's what kind of happens with them. This is a picture of he and Mary. And then when they move to Vermont, he starts being outdoorsy. He apparently later in life, and I say later in life, during this decade, he developed a lot of anxiety. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it, because he was always meeting a deadline. Somebody was always hammering him, you've got to get this done, this has to happen now. And he has to come up with the idea, he has to pose the model, he has to create the painting within a matter of days. So he develops a lot of anxiety and eventually develops depression from it. But in Vermont, he gets to be outside, and he and his wife have 3 children while they're there. So he kind of firmly settles into life there.
So we made it kind of through the 20s and then the 30s, and so the change of scenery that he has in Vermont seems to be good for him. And so talk to us about the influences that he had on some of the paintings.
So they go to Vermont, he has a whole new group of people that he can choose from as models, change of scenery, mountains, those kinds of things. And he's really influenced early on by this guy. Some of you may have heard of Bregel before. So this guy is a painter from the 16th century. It was done in 1567. And this is kind of an early version of what Rockwell did, right? If you stop and think about it. So it's European, it's Northern Europe, but you've got people gathering outside, as people like to do. It looks like maybe they're having some drinks, having a good time. And this is an image, this is a painting that hung over his mantle. It was, he obviously didn't have the original, but this was what he liked. And it's interesting because, again, we can see this in what he ends up producing while he's there in Vermont, and it really has a big influence on what he does.
For sure.
And he, again, gets to be outside, gets to play with his boys, obviously has dogs, and just, I think, really, this was a good time for him. Being there, from what I gather, helped him deal with his anxiety and some other things that he was going through at that time.
Well, obviously we know what happens near the end of the 1930s, and so, there's the outbreak of World War II, and how was Rockwell impacted by the war, and do we see that in his work since he was painting a lot of local life at the time?
Yeah, so obviously Americana, all of that, he's kind of, the guy that the government goes to when they need an image for public consumption. So obviously Roosevelt, late 30s into the 40s and beginning of World War II, he's called upon quite often to do things for the government. So World War II breaks out, and he has this idea to create a set of 4 paintings based on Roosevelt's speech of the 4 freedoms. And he goes to the government. He has contacts. He knows people there. So he goes to Washington and he says, hey, I've got this idea. I'm going to do these paintings to illustrate his 4 freedoms. You can have them and you can sell them and sell the posters and raise money from them. Well, the government said, thanks, but no thanks. And so he was not deterred. He goes back home. He paints them anyway. You can see in this image, he's painting freedom of speech. There's his model in the background. There he is working on his canvas on the easel. And they run as consecutive Saturday Evening Post covers. And they're wildly popular. People just kind of lose their mind over them. Because remember, this is 1942, 1943, so we're in the middle of World War II. A lot is going on. And he illustrates, freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of religion, and freedom of speech. And so the government, guess what they do? Guess who calls him back up?
They're like, whoa, whoa, whoa.
Yeah, we may have made a mistake. So they call him back up. They have thousands and thousands and thousands of posters printed. These paintings, the original paintings, go on tour across the United States to raise money for war bonds, and they raise over $130 million. Yeah, in 1943.
Which, I did not do the math myself, but we looked this up. In today's money, that would be $2.35 billion, which is insane. But, so invest in art, y'all.
It's always interesting to me because when it comes to art, we often think about the monetary value.
Yeah.
And there's so many other inherent values related to art that I hope people think about too. But it is impressive when you understand that 4 paintings toured the United States, millions of posters were sold based on these paintings, and raised what would now be billions of dollars. Would that happen today? I don't know. It's hard to say, but it happened then, and it set him, right? I mean, it ingrained him firmly in the American conscience as the man who was sort of the American artist. He's our American artist at this point. So.
Well, and clearly what he did struck a chord with people where everybody could kind of connect with what he was doing, which was really helpful. So.
I mean, what he's painting, we know this. Yeah. This is recognizable, this is real. We've all been tucked into bed or tucked our kids into bed at night. We've all sat down at a table with our family to eat, and the other things too. So it absolutely struck a chord. And I think he was painting an idea, and I think that's an important thing, because that's what registers with people more often.
Well, since we talk about how he was inspired by Roosevelt, how is his personal life reflected in his work?
So what's interesting is sometimes career and personal life don't always jive. So if you're doing really great in your career, sometimes your personal life suffers, and vice versa. So his personal life suffered at this time because he was so busy, he was doing so much work, he was a workaholic, he was a loner, really and truly. So his marriage to Mary kind of hits a bumpy patch in the mid-40s, and they separate for a while. And he goes to the West Coast. While he's there, he does this illustration for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, which is called Christmas Homecoming. And you see his sons, you see him in the background with his pipe, and you see Mary hugging the son that's just returned home. So, even when he's going through kind of a personal crisis, he continues to work. So he perseveres through it and is successful. But they kind of still continued to have rough patches along the way.
Well, and you mentioned earlier that he had some mental health struggles. How did this impact his life and also his family's situation?
So he and his wife both really kind of had some issues. So she was an alcoholic. And in 1951, she went to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, to a place to be treated. And Stockbridge, Massachusetts is in the western part of the state, so it's in the Berkshires. And if you've ever been up there, it's bucolic, it's beautiful. It is, if you haven't been and you can go, do yourself a favor and go. So she goes to Stockbridge. He stays in Vermont. He goes to see her often while she is there. And during her treatment, he becomes really interested in psychoanalysis. And he starts talking to her doctors about his anxiety and his depression. They start prescribing him some medicine, needless to say, because that's what happens. And it helps him, and she is being helped. She's responding well to her treatment. And so in 1953, literally, he sort of left visiting her one Friday afternoon, and on Sunday, he's back in Stockbridge with all of his belongings and buying a house. So he very impulsively decides to move to Stockbridge, Massachusetts. It wasn't really something that he gave a lot of thought to and just did it. And he did it really to be close to her, but also to pursue his own treatment. And it was a time, I think the anxiety had gotten really bad at that point for him. We're sort of talking early to mid 50s. And he had to deal with it. So, because he was so busy.
Well, we know that part of why he was really busy was from the Saturday Evening Post. But around this time, there were some shifts that started happening with the Saturday Evening Post. So can you talk about that and how that kind of diverged from his work?
Yeah, so just to kind of touch again on how busy he was in this anxiety real quick before we move on.
Yeah.
So he presents this, he's called to Washington to present the portrait of Eisenhower. And he goes to the White House, and he's staying at the White House for this presentation. And he forgot his anxiety medicine. And he was so crippled with the anxiety of forgetting his medicine that he almost did not attend the presentation of this portrait. But he struggled through it, which was a good thing for him to do because he saw that he could kind of manage it on his own. Now, the 50s, a lot of things happen politically. There are a lot of shifts going on in the United States. And he starts to change what he's doing a little bit. So we're kind of in like 1957, 1958. This is an image of he and his son. His wife, Mary, died suddenly in 1959 of a heart attack. And she laid down to take a nap, didn't wake up. So he never really talked about it. He just didn't. He just sort of plunged into work deeper than he already was. He's already a workaholic, but he just goes in even harder. And he really kind of churns out during this time period some of his most, some of his most mature work. And this is an image from that time. Anybody ever seen this one before? Yeah. Yeah, it's triple self-portrait. And I think it's a really mature image for a lot of reasons. First of all, what a clever idea, right? You've got this, he's working on a self-portrait. He's probably made himself a little more handsome than he actually was. Nothing wrong with that.
We like it when artists do that for us.
Yeah, right. He's got this, this really kind of antique mirror with this, this sort of American motif on the top of it. He's got references to Van Gogh. He's got a Picasso reference. He's got a Rembrandt reference, a Dürer reference, and then he's got this helmet at the top, which is sort of the ultimate symbol of masculinity. And that was another thing Rockwell kind of struggled with. He was slight, he was thin, he never considered himself, he was not athletic at all, and he liked to kind of surround himself with like really strong athletic men and people. And so it's interesting to me that he put that helmet in there, which is again kind of the ultimate symbol of that. But there are so many details. If you look at this painting, it's so clever, it's so well done. Technically, it's just stunning. I mean, to be able to do that. And it's a story. Like at the beginning, the thing said, the first and last thing is the story. And we look at this and we know what the story is. So he's doing some really clever work at this time, although again, there are struggles in his personal life.
Yeah. But then didn't you say that the Saturday Evening Post started wanting to go more toward a different direction?
Yeah, so we're talking late 50s, early 60s, counterculture starts happening, the Kennedy assassination happens, which changes so many things, and he gets married again. So he meets wife number 3, whose name is also Mary. She was from Boston. Mary too. She was a school teacher, and this was his happiest marriage.
Because it was a school teacher, right?
Exactly. So it probably wasn't a great love match, but they were great companions. They were intellectual equals. And she was good for him, he was good for her. So it was a good time. And it was a time, as you pointed out, that things were starting to shift at the Saturday Evening Post because, up until that time, it was about Americana, it was about small towns, it was about going to get your marriage license. a runaway at the lunch counter with a policeman, you know, a kid with a black eye. All of those things were in his work. But things were shifting, and it was starting to be about politics and celebrities and things that were less local and more global and national. So he has to really think about what he's doing and how he's doing it. And she was really kind of the perfect person to help him do that. She, I think, you know, from what I've read, I didn't know any of this before I started researching this, but she pointed a lot of things out to him and opened his eyes in a lot of ways to a lot of things that were going on around him. And he starts looking at things differently, and he starts creating some very interesting work. And I think this is one of them. You know, this is, how many of you have seen this one before? This new for some of you? Yeah. So this painting is interesting to me because we don't know who this man is. We don't see his face. He has his back to us. He seems maybe educated. He seems possibly affluent based on the way that he's dressed. You know, he has his umbrella, he has his hat, he has something, he has a glove on, and he's contemplating this painting that maybe he doesn't understand. So he's, you know, he's contemplating his future and where does he fit into this future. And this is really Rockwell, right? I mean, that's what it has to be. So, anybody know the artist that painting would be based on? Jackson Pollock. Very good. I'm impressed. Yeah. So, and you know, Norman Rockwell had a great time creating this. There are photographs of him in his studio with the canvas down, and he's blocked out where the guy's going to be, and he's just slinging paint everywhere. And it's fun to do a Pollock-esque painting. It's a really cool thing. But you know, when you're classically trained and your livelihood is about painting all of the things that we mentioned a few minutes ago.
Where do you fit?
Where do you fit into this? So, but what a clever image. And again, there's a story, and we start filling in the blanks with this story, and we know what this man is thinking and what's going through his head is, you know, there's obviously a generational shift happen, and is Norman Rockwell, where does he fit in? Is he going to be extinct? What's going to happen to him? So.
And doesn't he leave the post then?
He does. Yeah, he leaves the post in 1963, in September of '63, because he really kind of wanted to tackle more controversial subjects. And again, Mary kind of helps him with this. Here you see a painting on his easel that's very different from anything that he had done prior to this, which is this image. And you know, it's the golden rule. And it's people that, you know, these people were not living in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, many of them. So he had to go and he had to find these models. And also at this point, he was relying on the camera a lot. You know, when he started in 1916, he wasn't relying on the camera, but sort of in the 30s and 40s, he started using it quite often. So, you know, what a profound image, because we can all find ourselves in that image. We're there, and we see people that we know, and maybe not people that we encounter every day, but people who are like us and are concerned about the same things that we are. And so that's what interested him at that point in time. And other things too, other social issues. You know, this one's titled "The Problem We All Live With," which obviously is something that was going on in the 60s. So he would not have been able to tackle something like this at the Saturday Evening Post, but he was working for Look magazine at that time, and they encouraged him to do it. So when he kind of went for it, and you know, again, there's a story. It's all right there, and really makes you kind of stop and contemplate it. And you know, this painting ended up, you know, there you see him working on it on his easel, and it ends up in the White House. And there's Ruby Bridges, the girl that's in the painting, talking to the president. So, yeah, years later.
Pretty incredible.
Yeah, it really is.
So there clearly was a shift for him, and now we're getting toward the end of his life. And so I know he died in the 1970s. So what were the last few years of his life like?
Yeah, so the last few years of his life were good. He was obviously financially quite secure. He was a huge success. He didn't have to worry about a lot of things. He was a really reluctant celebrity. This is Irving Penn. Anybody know who Irving Penn is? Ever heard of Irving Penn? Very famous photographer. So, you know, people would sort of come to Stockbridge to kind of pay homage to him at this point. So he was always meeting with famous artists, people from a lot of different arts and things, and he enjoyed it. He would go to movie sets and paint people like Bing Crosby. He was called to do fun things like that. So, obviously had a good last few years. He traveled with his paintings. Here he is with the Four Freedoms later in his life, probably speaking at an engagement, I would imagine. Called on to do political portraits, always of the candidates that were running for presidential election for whatever the year was. Teaching classes. I think he was sort of the unofficial tour guide also of Stockbridge, Massachusetts. He was he loved to ride bicycles, so there he is doing that. Went to his studio every day. Still called on by the government occasionally to do paintings. He was commissioned to do a painting of a dam out west, and he really kind of struggled with this painting because he said, what you need is a technical drawing, you don't need a painting. So he figured out a way to put a human element in it, went and met this family, and put them into the painting. Yeah, so again, a story, right? He was telling the story with this painting, which is really kind of phenomenal. But he did enter into decline sort of the last 4 years of his life in Stockbridge. He had dementia, but he had great care, and every day he was taken to his studio. And he was kind of allowed to paint, on a blank canvas with no paint on his brushes, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
So,
what a lovely way for an artist to have a peaceful end to their life, being able to do what felt like muscle memory for them, for sure.
And then I'm going to leave this up when we end tonight. I just want you to, at some point, just to take the time to read it, because he didn't consider himself a great artist. Somebody would say something to him, and he would always sort of go over and knock on a piece of wood and say, it's going to end any time. I'm the luckiest guy in the world. But I think that this quote from 1962 from a magazine article kind of sums up where he placed himself in fine art, illustration, all of that, which is always part of the conversation with Rockwell.
Yeah. So we're going to close as we always do. If we want to see his work in person, how can we make that happen for ourselves?
So Stockbridge, Massachusetts has the largest collection of his work. That's where he, of course, lived. There's a museum there dedicated to his work. My parents took me there in the 1990s, about 30 years ago, right? Yeah.
In the 1900s?
In the 1900s. And we went back a few years, 10 years or so after that, we went back, right? And it's great. It's phenomenal. As I mentioned earlier, it's a beautiful part of the country. The museum is fabulous. You can get up close and personal to all of these paintings.
The Four Freedoms are there.
Four Freedoms are there. And great shows are going on, things like that. Has a lovely gift shop. Which everybody
get your umbrellas and all that.
And then there is an American Museum of Illustration in Newport, Rhode Island, and they have a large collection of his work. There was a show that came through at the Frist, 12 years ago, 13 years ago, something like that. So occasionally things do happen. There was a huge show of his at the Guggenheim, which the Guggenheim in New York City is a very modern museum, but they hosted a show of his work in 2011. So things do happen, but they're worth seeing. They're fascinating up close and personally. The paint is so thick.
Yeah. Well, and sometime if you pay me extra, I'll tell you about my moment with Rockwell, but this isn't about me. So, but yes, you definitely get transfixed by them. So, well, thank you so much for telling us all about this. And if you all want to enjoy more refreshments and more drink, please stay, talk about your own Rockwell memories. And thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thank you.